A very good evening to you. Thanks for choosing Newzroom Afrika here with News at Prime. We start off with this. Reports today confirmed that the reason the Chippa United versus Royal AM match was postponed without reason is due to a strike by Royal players. Royal AM players have allegedly not returned to training this year, making the scheduled match this Saturday impossible. The Chilli Boys released a statement expressing their disappointment yesterday as the notification was given to the club without consultation. This comes after SARS raided the home of founder and owner Sean Mkhize and attached her assets as they aim to recoup a reported amount of 40 million rand in unpaid taxes. To chat more about this story is Africa Business of Sport podcast co-host Jabu Mtwa. A very good afternoon and welcome to Newzroom Afrika. Good to be chatting to you. I suppose when we saw the raid just a couple of weeks ago on Mkhize's house, we did anticipate that this would have a huge knock-on effect on the club, and we're now seeing that a month and a half later.
Yeah, absolutely, Valen. It's a very concerning development for Royal AM fans and mostly players and the workforce, especially because this has huge implications for their livelihoods and their jobs. This is a very unprecedented situation, as this is the first time SARS has officially taken over a club, in that it is taking control of an entity that is owned by Sean Mkhize, who is obviously in lots of tax debts, over just under 40 million rand, if that is the correct report. So it's pretty unprecedented what is happening right now, and it's uncertain how Royal AM will continue going forward, especially with their players being unpaid their salaries in December.
What does the National Soccer League's handbook say in a situation like this? We've never seen a club being liquidated or being taken control of by our National Revenue Service. So what does the league now do?
Exactly, and it's interesting, the league's position, because they have dealt the first hand here in that they have postponed the match without giving justifications to Chippa United. So it's pretty uncertain where they go forward. In terms of the handbook, this sort of situation is overlooked, I would say, because there aren't any real direct regulations when it comes to a club that is under tax. However, we can look at club licensing regulations, which does give lots of direction when it comes to what clubs have to comply with for them to be able to participate as a club in the PSL. So clubs do have to have a bank account, for example. Their taxes must be in the correct state of order. And so if they are not complying with those club licensing regulations, it does seem to be that is a case that the PSL and the executive committee in this situation could either hand a fine to Royal AM, a reprimand, or even expel them from the Premier Soccer League, which has not happened in these circumstances. So this is an unprecedented situation, and whatever follows is certainly going to be happening for the first time.
If a club has to get expelled, what happens to the club status then? I know we're talking a bit in hypotheticals, but what would happen to the club status? We know that clubs have sold their status for millions or reported millions of rands. So that's really where the value lies in the team. And one would hope that the team and the players and the technical staff can still have a job and be able to be taken over with the status being bought. But if you're expelled by the NSL handbook, as you explained it, what then happens to the status?
Well, as you can imagine, the status is going to be almost useless to the club, because their valuation as a football club will nosedive, given that they are not paying their players and are not complying with the PSL's club licensing situation. So what would happen in this scenario is that the club status would not be in the hands of the Royal AM or their founders themselves, and would be taken back from the club, which obviously would have ripple effects in terms of their workforce. In this case, players would now have the right to enforce just cause in their contracts, in terms of them being able to terminate their contracts. And this would be a situation where they're able to now go to different clubs for no transfer fee. So this puts their situation in a very grave circumstance, because this is a club which has done, decently in terms of getting mid-table finishes over the past few years. And so for them and their status being completely just taken away from their hands, you can imagine that there are going to be consequences which are going to put the players in this situation in a very difficult circumstance.
We are in an open transfer window. We've got about 3 weeks left in that before the January transfer window closes. Some teams bolster their sides. It's not really something that we've seen a lot in South Africa. It's usually pre-season that they do that. I suppose that's also a concern for the players if they do, in fact, not have a club to go to.
Exactly, and this would bring the famous article from the FIFA regulations up to question. Yeah, so if you look at Article 14 from FIFA's regulations on the status and transfer of players, again, it states that any party within a contractual agreement is able to terminate a player's contract where there is just cause. The article continues to mention that in the case where the club is failing to pay a salary for 2 consecutive months, the player will be deemed to have just cause to terminate their contract, provided that they put the club in default in writing and grant them a deadline of at least 15 days for them to fully comply with their financial obligations to the players. So in practice, upon the termination of the player's contract by the player, based on just cause, given that they're not being paid their salaries at this moment in time, they will be free to sign for any club as a free agent. And this would essentially mean that the player's new club would not be obliged to pay Royal AM a transfer fee, which is certainly not in their interest, given that transfer fees are the main sources of revenue for any football club, especially, as you mentioned, the January transfer window has opened. So this further compromises the club's current position, given that they are under a transfer ban at the moment in time, which was imposed by FIFA after the club were found guilty of unlawfully failing to pay their former striker, Samir Nakovic, his salary for 2 consecutive months, and now they owe him in excess of over 15 million rand, excluding the interest, obviously. So it's a pretty difficult position. They can't do much because they have the transfer ban during this transfer window. Players themselves will have to terminate their own contracts in order to get moved to different clubs, obviously on a free, so that makes it easier. But it's just a situation that is pretty unfortunate, and it puts players here and their agents in pretty difficult waters.
The PSL has been quiet on the matter. Do you have any thoughts on perhaps why that would be, especially if we're looking at a situation where the club can cease to exist?
I would say it's pretty concerning. Chippa United in their statement rather mentioned that they were given no reason whatsoever as to the postponement of the match. What I would look upon and try to mull over is the PSL's initial decision in approving Sean Mkhize as an owner of a football club, given that the NSL handbook outlines that the executive committee is the one that approves whether a club can be taken over by another owner. Approving an owner who has well-documented tax issues and is a prominent businesswoman who, it's well known that she's been having a long battle with SARS stretching back to 2013. So I think it's pretty concerning that the PSL is quiet on this. I would expect some sort of press conference or a statement to come very soon, given that SARS is now involved in this. But it's definitely not a good look on the general corporate governance of PSL clubs. But in this case now, in terms of communication and PR, the PSL is in a very difficult situation.
Jabu Mtwa is Africa Business or Sport podcast co-host. Thank you very much for your time here on Newzroom Afrika.